Hello and welcome to the Law School Playbook. Today's topic is Introduction to the Socratic Method. If you're new to law school, you're just thinking about law school, you're probably not exactly sure what the Socratic Method is. And maybe you're a little bit aware of it from watching movies like The Paper Chase or perhaps Legally Blonde. But basically, the Socratic Method is an exchange between the professor and a student in which the professor gets information from the student that's helpful for the overall learning in the course. So in our reading and briefing, we talked about the various parts of a legal opinion or a legal decision written by a judge that will be helpful to your learning, and those are contained in your casebook. So your professor might say, please tell me about the facts of Roe versus Wade, or how did the case arrive in the court? What's the procedural history in this decision? What rationale did the court use? What was the reasoning the court gave in reaching its decision? What was the decision? What was the holding? What's the policy or the reason for the rule in this case? And what is the rule itself? What can we take away from this case that we could use in other cases with similar facts? And then once the professor has elicited that type of information, so the basics from the case, and the class has an overall understanding of the case, the professor then introduces what's called a hypothetical. And it's a fact pattern where the professor will change a fact or two from the case. It's very similar, but they stretch the rule to get you thinking like a lawyer. So how would this rule that we learned in this case apply to a new set of facts? So it takes some getting used to, and most first-year courses use the Socratic method as opposed to a straight lecture method. So where did it even come from? What's a brief history of the Socratic method? So this is a bust of Socrates, and this is who the Socratic method is named after, hence the name. And as you probably know, he was a Greek philosopher who engaged in questioning of his students to discover moral and ethical truths. But the law wasn't originally taught that way. Law school was originally taught through a lecture method and really tested through rote memorization, until this gentleman came along, and his name is Christopher Columbus Langdell, and he changed it to the Socratic method. He was a professor and later became the dean of Harvard Law School. So when you are in the hot seat answering questions, you have Christopher Columbus Langdell to thank. Okay, so what's the logistics of how the Socratic method works? It really depends on the professor. They all do it a bit differently. So some just cold call from a seating chart. So you'll fill out your seating chart when the semester starts and they'll just randomly pick people. Others just randomly pick a student. It doesn't matter where you are in the seating chart. They won't go down the row or anything. They'll just randomly pick somebody out. Some professors do alphabetically, so then you have a sense of where you are. Or others use note cards or playing cards with your name on them. And, so these are all different ways that the professor might choose who to ask the questions to. There are professors who are kind enough to tell you in advance when you are quote unquote on call, and it may just be for the week, so you're on call for the week, or you may know the particular class, and of course your preparation, my guess, will be a little heightened effort during those times. But the idea is to prepare for learning the information and for the final exam as opposed to when you are on call. So why do we use the Socratic method? It seems painful. I still remember being called on while I was in law school. It was in civil procedure, was the first time I was called on, and my professor had us rise, and I was standing for about 45 minutes answering questions about the case, and it was brutal, and I'm sure no one remembers it but me. These are things I know are very uncomfortable, but there is a reason why we use the Socratic method. And that is, it teaches students to think like lawyers, to think analytically. So, through the Socratic method, your professor can explore the various possible outcomes, and the hypotheticals themselves, generate thinking and discussion. It makes the class much more active. Every student is prepared. Every student is engaged. So there is a method behind the madness, and that is why we use it. And you'll hear, oh, you go to law school to think like a lawyer. And it really is true. You're not going to learn a bunch of legal principles that you should memorize and just be able to spout off the top of your head. In most cases, giving an answer that's based on your memorization of the law would be malpractice. So you're always going to be looking things up and researching to figure out if the concept that you're aware of is still good law and things like that. But what's most important is that you develop the skill to think analytically, and the Socratic method helps you do that. How do you deal with the discomfort? Well, first of all, keep it in perspective. So we have here a courtroom. There will come a point for most attorneys, if you're going to be a litigator, that you are going to have to face questioning from someone other than your professor, maybe a judge, maybe a panel of judges, maybe an administrative law judge, maybe an arbitrator. It's important that you get comfortable with this type of questioning. It will be good when you do moot court and appellate advocacy. To make it a little more comfortable for yourself, try speaking regularly in class. It'll get easier each time. And then one thing I tell students, and I have to remind myself of often, is that in law school and in life, you have to get comfortable with the idea of being uncomfortable. When you are uncomfortable, you experience growth. And if you're always comfortable, you're not stretching yourself to learn and try new things. Cassie Christopher, who's a professor, refers to this as a desirable difficulty. The best learning takes place when you are uncomfortable. So try and keep that in mind and keep it in perspective, and everybody ends up in the hot seat one way or the other. Okay, so what are some of the pros with this method? Well, you have a very active class, creates interest, generates discussion in the class. You get instant feedback. If you read a case and you took away from it something that was completely different than what the professor wanted you to take away from it, you'll know instantly through the Socratic method. And it offers different perspectives. So the professor isn't just lecturing, giving the professor's view of the law or the case. It invites different perspectives through the Socratic method. And then the use of hypotheticals, again, is teaching you how to think analytically. In terms of the cons, and there are some, it's intimidating. Students feel very uncomfortable. It's anxiety-inducing. It's also time-consuming. So at my first job, I had a bit of time between college and law school, and I was working at a job where one of my supervisors taught constitutional law. And he said, I could teach constitutional law in a week, but because we use the Socratic method, it really slows things down. And I think what he was saying, I'm not sure that con law could be taught in a week, by the way, but I think what he was saying is, if all we were going to do is give you a set of rules to memorize, law school certainly could be a lot shorter, but through the Socratic method, we're teaching you how to think, and that is more time consuming. And then the biggest con that I see is that when you are in the hot seat, especially if it lasts a week or so, you are not typically able to take good notes. So that's actually something I want to talk about here for a minute. So I asked my TA about a year or so ago if she could do a bit of research to see what the recommended practices are for taking notes while you're being called on. And there was nothing on it at all. And I think because there isn't a really good answer to this, I think this is one of those times that it might be worthwhile if you could not be too critical of yourself, to go back and listen to a recording of the class if the professor records it. You also should find a colleague, a fellow student who you can rely on for notes. Heaven forbid you have an emergency come up or something like that. And in this instance, you may have to rely on someone else's notes or, maybe two people's notes. Chances are that you'll remember the information pretty well. All these years later, I still remember what case I was called on for the first time, but it's still helpful to get the notes. So don't just get called on, give your answers and give up. Make sure that you loop back around and get the notes that you need for that class. So those are my thoughts on the Socratic method. Remember that if you are doing it, and even if you perform poorly, you're just going to be doing a public service because everyone will breathe a sigh of relief that it wasn't them. It isn't any reflection on you. This is part of the process. So keep in mind that you can do it. And as always, I'll be rooting for you. Thanks.